Hello, this is Matthias Fitzi from IOHK. I'm going to talk about fast isomorphic state channels, and this is joint work with Manuel Chakravarty, Sandro Coretti Drayton, Gaži, Philipp, Kant, Aggelos, Kiayias, and Alexander Russell. The major problem of blockchain scalability is that every single transaction is secured by global replication and verification, at least in the vanilla version of protocols. And the implications are massive use of storage, low transaction throughput, and high confirmation latency. A promising way to mitigate this problem is to run your functionality off-chain, optimistically, but still secure it on the blockchain for the worst case. And this has the effect that not every transaction has to be settled on the blockchain. This line of work was initiated already at the early stages of Bitcoin with the famous example of the Lightning Network, and with the most recent line of work about multi-party state channels in the Sprites paper by Miller et al. And by the virtual multi-party state channels paper by Jimbowski et al. And not very surprisingly, those solutions improve overall of the above problems, at least in the optimistic case where there are no faults in the off-chain protocol. As a small example, imagine a group of parties who want to play a game of poker, but they don't want to do it on the global blockchain ledger. So what they can do is they can cut out some funds from the global ledger, put them into a mini ledger and operate it off-chain in a separate protocol, quasi-independently of the general blockchain protocol. And then once they are done, or maybe they detect some cheating at some point, they can just take the latest state and reintegrate it into the global blockchain ledger and then continue from this state on the global ledger. And what these parties just made use of is a multi-party state channel. Or a little bit more precisely, the idea of a multi-party state channel is to add a separate off-chain protocol among multiple parties on top of a blockchain with the following security goals. One of them is safety. That means that under any form of cheating, no bad effects are allowed to happen. That means there should be no generation or loss of funds due to the operation of such an off-chain protocol. And the other one is liveness, which is the optimistic condition, which basically is that in case of no cheating in the off-chain protocol, all transactions in the off-chain protocol get eventually processed. So we observe two modes of operations basically. We have this optimistic off-chain operation, which gives a very efficient best case, but still we want to remain secure, so we still have a pessimistic on-chain fallback to the global blockchain in the worst case to guarantee safety. There are two major ledger maintenance models in blockchain technology. One is account-based, as in Ethereum, and the other one is UTXO, which stands for unspent transaction output, as in Bitcoin. And if you want to design state channels, of course, we have to ask ourselves the question whether the way we maintain the ledger impacts the design of our state channels. And not so amazingly, the answer is yes. So let's go for a quick comparison between these ledger maintenance models. In the account-based model, we basically have a set of accounts, like for Alice, Bob, and Charlie, and then we can process transactions like transferring funds from Alice to Bob, and then from Bob to Charlie, etc. And then after having processed these transactions, we just arrive in a new global account state, which accounts for the new balances. In the UTXO model, rather than aggregating funds into accounts, we maintain value outputs, and these outputs can be split or combined. So in the UTXO model, if Alice wants to pay 42 ADA to Bob, as in the account-based example to the left, what she actually does, if she holds an output of 100 ADA, she issues a transaction that splits those 100 ADA into 42 that go to Bob and 58 that go back to herself. And if later Bob wants to pay 50 ADA to Charlie, those 42 ADA are not enough, so Bob can combine those 42 ADA with another output holding 10 ADA, combine them together, and then split this sum of 52 ADA into 50 to Charlie and 2 ADA back to Bob. Now the state that results from these two transactions is of course equivalent to the state that results on the left hand side, although the representation is a little bit more complex. However, we will see that this representation is greatly helpful for designing efficient state channel protocol. Going from simple payments to smart contracts, we observe that the standard way in the account-based model to implement smart contracts is basically via the definition of contract accounts which have global state. The UTXO model was extended to handle smart contracts by Chakravarty et al. At last year's Financial Crypto, and this model is called the extended UTXO model. And what it does, it defines an output as a triple, and the output triple consists of a value, which is a set of tokens, a validator script that controls the transition of state, and a data script that holds state. Now if you want to spend such an output, or rather the value inside, you have to come up with a redeemer row that allows its spending in the sense that the validator script of the spent output accepts this redeemer as a spending witness. Now assume you want to take a contract off-chain. That means you have to find out what the state of this contract really is. And how do you determine the state of a contract in an account-based model? And the answer maybe is don't try to, because it's really hard to tell. And why is that so? It's because the contract state is part of this really entangled global monolithic state. And there might be a lot of cross-contract calls going on. So it's really hard to go in and trying to disentangle this state and cleanly extract it from the account-based ledger. In the UTXO model, it's different because each output carries its own validation code. That means each output basically is an autonomous substate of the ledger. So if I want to take a contract state off-chain, I just have to collect all the EUTXOs that belong to this smart contract instance, and I'm basically done. Trying to wrap up this ledger maintenance models versus state channels discussion, let's have a look at a state channel lifecycle as we implement it. The blockchain protocol with the respective timeline is depicted in blue, and the goal is to implement an off-chain protocol as depicted in green on top of it. And such a lifecycle basically consists of 3 stages. The first stage being to control the transfer of state from the blockchain ledger to the off-chain ledger. The second stage being to progress state quasi-independently from the blockchain with means of a BFT-like protocol off-chain. by use of multi-signatures that can later be used as witnesses for events that happened on this off-chain protocol. And then finally, at some point, to have a control transfer of state from the off-chain ledger back to the blockchain ledger to finish the execution of this state channel. Now let's have a look how an implementation of this would look in either of the ledger maintenance models. We saw that in the account-based model where we have this monolithic state, and so it's really hard to extract substate. So what the solution is for state transfer as of stages 1 and 3 is that actually for each contract that wants to be taken off-chain, a new translation contract needs to be explicitly written that takes care of this state transfer, which of course is very cumbersome. And for off-chain transaction confirmation, we need strict transaction sequentialization because we don't know a priori how dependencies of transactions are on each other. And actually both comparison papers take a different approach on that. The Jimbowski paper makes use of a synchronous protocol which allows for this sequentialization, and the Sprites paper takes a leader-based yet asynchronous approach to address this problem, where the leader basically just takes care of sequentialization. In the EU TXO model, we saw that we have these easily separable substates. So for state transfer as of stages 1 and 3, we can simply move a set of EU TXOs back and forth without any further efforts, basically. And for off-chain transaction confirmation, we actually can process transactions concurrently, so we don't need ordering, at least as long as they don't try to spend the same UTXOs. And to conclude this comparison, we can observe that in the account-based model, we need extra code for each contract that wants to live off-chain. And we need strict transaction sequentialization for confirmation off-chain, which tendentially makes confirmation slow. Whereas in the EU TXO model, we have this isomorphic property. That means we can simply move EU TXOs around and they always retain the same representation. And it allows for concurrent transaction processing off-chain, which of course tends to be faster than if transactions have to be sequentialized. So it may not come as a surprise that we do exactly this in this paper. We build fast isomorphic state channels in the EU TXO model. The big picture of our protocol looks as follows. On the main chain, we maintain a state machine that secures the off-chain protocol, which mainly consists of 4 states, at least in this simplified version. We have an initial state where the off-chain parameters are fixed, basically the participant set and the public key material. We then transition into an open state where we have the UTXOs from the blockchain committed ready to be processed off-chain. And then at some point, some participant of the off-chain protocol may decide to finish the off-chain protocol, which sets the main chain state machine into the closed state when a race begins, wherein the parties can compete in submitting the latest off-chain state on-chain, and then finally we go in a final state that makes the state that got transferred from the off-chain protocol ready to be evolved again on the blockchain. In the off-chain part, we confirm events using n of n multi-signatures. And these multi-signatures can be used later as on-chain witnesses to prove existence of events or states, or that at least a certain event or state was valid at some point, at least during the protocol execution. And then, in order to contest on the main chain if a claimed event or state is obsolete, you can basically just show a later witness which will show that what was seen on the main chain before is obsolete. The state transitions are initiated by submitting respective transactions on the blockchain, and in order to guarantee that the state machine really operates as defined, we make use of this nice idea of thread tokens in a paper by Chakravarty et al. In the initial state, we forge such a thread token and then pass it along as the UTXO that has to be consumed by the following state transition transaction. And finally, when we're done in the final state, we burn this token again. However, there is still a problem. We have, in this state diagram, we have two phases where we want multiple users to give data as input. On the left side, parties want to commit their UTXOs, and on the right side, they want to compete for the latest witness of the off-chain state. So how can we collect user data in O of 1 confirmations? We achieve this by forging in the initial state, additionally to the blue thread token, one participation token per party that wants to participate in the off-chain protocol. And then the step transition actually follows in two phases. In the first phase, every party gets a chance to consume its own participation token in order to provide input. And then in a second stage, the state transition happens that not only collects the thread token, but also makes sure by validation that all the participation tokens and thus the complete set of inputs was collected. The off-chain protocol can be seen as consisting of three stages. In the first stage, the protocol receives an initial UTXO set from the open state of the Mainchain state machine, plus some public key material. In a second stage, the state evolves, and then in a third state, the final state of the off-chain protocol gets pushed back to the main chain. And as the phases 1 and 3 are mainly controlled by the main chain, we now focus on stage 2, state evolution, and make the following observation again, that it's fully safe to process transactions in parallel as long as they consume disjoint UTXOs. So we go for fully concurrent transaction confirmation. So if I have a transaction, I don't really pay attention to what else is going on in the off-chain protocol. I just try to have my transaction confirmed. And this confirmation process is a three phase subprotocol where I send my transaction to all other participants, collect respective signatures of a multi-signature scheme, and then combine them to a multi-signature, and then I redistribute this multi-signature to everybody. And the rule is that as soon as I've seen a valid multi-signature on a transaction, then I'm sure that it actually happened and that it will be eventually reflected on the main chain. Now we have an additional mechanism which is actually sequential, and the purpose of this is garbage collection. We don't want to maintain the full transaction history of an off-chain protocol, but we want to keep a minimal current state of things. So how are snapshots processed? The first snapshot is the initial UTXO set that comes from the main chain, and then maybe during the protocol some transactions get confirmed, and then at some point it's maybe Alice's turn to create a new snapshot. So what she prepares actually is a snapshot U1, which is a set of UTXOs. And what she does is basically just apply the transaction she has seen so far to the last snapshot that was confirmed. And then this snapshot can be created as follows. Alice sends the hash of the transactions she wants to include to the other parties, collects the individual signatures of the parties, and then creates a multi-signature of U1 and distributes it back to the other parties. And note that everybody can actually compute the new UTXO set U1 from these hashes, because the fact that these transactions are actually confirmed means that everybody already is aware of those transactions. And then maybe, and then of course you can dispose of the history as soon as you see this multi-signature, and then maybe later there comes a transaction 3, and then it's Bob's turn to the next snapshot, etc. What I neglected so far is the situation about transaction conflicts. Note that in a smart contract ledger, a transaction conflict doesn't necessarily mean that anybody was trying to misbehave. It can just be that there is a race for the same UTXO to be consumed by different transactions. What now can happen in the transaction confirmation process, this three-phase process on top, is that different parties start multi-signing different transactions that are actually in conflict. And without further measures, this leads to a deadlock, because of course it's forbidden to give your signature on two different transactions that conflict with each other, because this would lead to inconsistent state. So how do we resolve this deadlock? And here we make use of the snapshots. We simply have the snapshot leaders resolve these conflicts explicitly in their snapshots. A short remark about getting the latest state back to the blockchain. The off-chain state actually not only consists of the latest snapshot in the off-chain protocol, at least in general, but there might also be some hanging transactions. So the rule was that as soon as I see a multi-signature on a transaction, then I can consider it valid. Now, of course, transaction can come in and get confirmed, and the off-chain protocol can now get closed without these transaction having gotten a chance to be picked up by a new snapshot. This now makes things a little bit more complicated when trying to get the latest off-chain state back to the blockchain. So we have to design a relatively fine-grained way of agreeing on how this latest witness looks on the off-chain protocol. And we have a two-stage process that actually first we determine what this witness is, and then only in a second phase the actual payload has to be delivered by one of the participants. We ran simulations in order to assess the transaction latency and throughput behavior of our protocol. And actually our initial goal was to compare it to all other sorts of scalability solutions out there. But then we saw that actually almost everybody uses a different setup and then tries to compare his solution by means of transactions per second, for example. So we decided not to do that, but actually to apply a baseline approach which is less dependent on such setup assumptions. So by a baseline, we measure an idealized version of the protocol and then compare our real protocol to the performance of this baseline protocol. For example, we have the universal baseline, which only measures the minimal actions required onto full trust. So what would that be? That would be transactions are verified on a logical level. Network messages are sent and they are also acknowledged. But what we don't take into account is anything that has to do with security. So no signatures are processed and the parties do not try to achieve consensus. And so if we can show that our protocol, our real protocol actually behaves very closely to this ideal protocol, then we can say that we are actually near physical limits, because actually what we include in the universal baseline is simply necessary by any protocol. And so how our evaluations then typically look is that our protocol indeed performs very close to such baselines, which leads us to conclude that our fast isomorphic state channels perform near physical limits. This lets me come to the conclusion. In the paper, we describe fast isomorphic state channels based on EUTXO, which has the following advantages over implementations in the account-based model. You can simply move UTXOs from and to the off-chain ledger instead of writing a new contract for each contract that wants to live off-chain. Off-chain transactions can be concurrently confirmed instead of leader-based sequentialization or making use of a synchronized protocol in the off-chain protocol. And finally, we observe that our protocol performs near physical limits.